Gaza might be small, but it generates huge headlines. Since October 7th, the 25-mile strip has been at the center of a brutal war between Israel and Hamas. But as both sides like to remind each other, history didn't start on October 7th. Over the past century, Gaza has changed hands 6 times, eventually ending up in the hands of Hamas. Who will rule the strip next? That's anyone's guess. But as the cliche goes, those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. So how did such a beautiful place devolve into blood, misery, and chaos? Gaza has stood in some form or another for 4,000 years. But our story starts in 1967. That's when Israel went to war against 3 of its neighbors. Tensions had been simmering for months, and Israelis were certain they were on the brink of extinction. But instead of being annihilated, they won. In under a week, the Jewish state quadrupled its territory, taking the Golan Heights from Syria, the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan, and the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip from Egypt. On its face, this sounds like an incredible victory, right? There was only one problem. There were already people living in these regions, and these Palestinians had a complicated relationship to Israel. Many of them were refugees who had been displaced 19 years before, as the Jewish state battled its neighbors for independence. Some had been forcibly expelled by the newly created Israeli army. Others had fled. Either way, most had spent the past 2 decades living in refugee camps. Now, roughly half of the world's Palestinians found themselves living under Israeli control. But Israel hadn't fought the war to expand its territory. On the eve of the war, Israelis were convinced they were on the brink of extermination. They viewed the war as one of survival, not expansion. So though the entire nation celebrated their astonishing victory, some prominent voices within the Jewish state called for an immediate, unilateral return of the territory without asking for anything in exchange.
המוצא האחד זהו מלחמה עד חורמה. באותה מלחמה הגיבוי של כל העולם יהיה לצד הערבי. האלטרנטיבה חלוקת הארץ בין שני העמים.
But plenty of Israelis didn't share this view. Religious nationalist Israelis, in particular, saw the victory as divine intervention, proof that they were meant to live in these areas. The West Bank in particular, also known as Judea and Samaria, is seeded with thousands of years of Jewish history, and the miraculous victory seemed like a return to that ancient history. So even as the government planned to potentially use its new territory as a bargaining chip, it encouraged citizens to build communities in the West Bank, Gaza, and Sinai. It was a strange position to take. On the one hand, Israel fully allowed its citizens to move to and build on the conquered territories. On the other, they still held on to the hope that they could barter these territories in exchange for recognition from their neighbors. But that's not what happened. Shortly after the war, the Arab League made their position clear, declaring no peace with Israel, no negotiation with Israel, no recognition of Israel. That lasted until a new Egyptian president bravely chose to make peace with Israel in exchange for the entire Sinai Peninsula. But when the Israelis tried to bundle Gaza in with the rest of the peninsula, Sadat was like,
thanks, but no thanks.
Why was Gaza such a hot potato? Why didn't Egypt want it back? Well, the short answer is that Gaza was never technically part of Egypt. Back in 1947, the UN had voted to split Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state. The Gaza Strip was supposed to be part of the Arab state, but that deal never happened. So if the Gaza Strip was originally supposed to be part of an Arab-Palestinian state, why didn't Israel just hand it over to the Palestinians instead of trying to strike a deal with Egypt?
Ooh, this is a great question. Oh my God, this is a great question.
Well, at the time, the Palestinians were represented by a coalition of groups known as the PLO. Politically, they were a relatively diverse bunch, but they all agreed on one thing. Israel had to go. Entirely. There was no way the Israelis were going to hand over Gaza to their sworn enemies. Plus, the PLO wasn't interested in ruling Gaza. They wanted all of the land. That's why Israel held on to Gaza after 1967. Egypt didn't want it, and handing it to the PLO was a non-starter. But that still left the issue of Gaza's 300,000 Palestinians. Now, You might also wonder why Israel didn't just offer citizenship to its new population. The answer might surprise you. It actually did. Sort of. Remember, Jews and Arabs had been at war with each other on and off since the 1920s. There was no trust between the two, and very little respect. Still, Israel offered two groups the opportunity to apply for Israeli citizenship: the Palestinians living in East Jerusalem and the Gazans who had been living in the Gaza Strip since before 1948. But both groups largely refused to apply for Israeli citizenship. Accepting citizenship meant they were collaborating with the enemy, tacitly agreeing to live under occupation. Refusing was an act of resistance. Which meant that even though Palestinians in Gaza were not Israeli citizens, they lived under an Israeli military administration. At first, the Israelis tried very hard to make their presence in Gaza invisible, but that turned out to be impossible. Invisible military rule is still military rule, and a hostile population is still a hostile population. Israel devised incentives to lure Palestinians out of Gaza and into the West Bank, from which they would likely go to Jordan. The biggest lure was providing temporary jobs, but when those jobs were finished, most Gazans chose to go back home to Gaza. And so Israel began deporting Gazans to the West Bank and Jordan under increasingly flimsy pretexts. The Jordanian king was not a fan of these deportations. He'd already taken in hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, and he was really starting to regret it. Mostly because the PLO kept attacking Israel, which meant that Israel would respond, usually by entering Jordan with tanks. To make matters even worse for King Hussein, the PLO kept trying to assassinate him. If he didn't get rid of them, he would lose his crown, if not his head. Eventually, he expelled the PLO for good, killing thousands of Palestinian civilians along the way. Meanwhile, ordinary Gazans were caught between a rock and a hard place. On the one side was Israeli military rule, which exercised strict control over the population. On the other side, however, were increasingly violent Palestinian groups who harassed, tortured, and killed anyone who was seen as collaborating with Israel. But the lure of good jobs was hard to resist. For years, Gaza's economy was one of the fastest growing in the world, helped along by Israeli loans for entrepreneurs and jobs within both Israel and Gaza. At the time, there was no wall separating the two territories. It may seem strange to us now, but both Jewish and Arab Israelis traveled to and from Gaza frequently. Israeli Arab citizens visited relatives in the Strip. Israeli Jews came in to shop and explore, lured by the relatively low prices in the markets. Meanwhile, Gazans were largely free to come and go as they pleased.
قبل 25 سنة أو 30 سنة كان الوضع جاي مبسوطين نطلع وين نطلع إسرائيل نطلع مصر نطلع الأردن نسافر الطريق مفتوحة كانت وعايشين وفيه فلوس.
But this period of relative calm didn't last. For one, the Strip's economic dependence on Israel was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, Palestinians were making money. On the other, there were very few opportunities to work inside the Strip, and almost no demand for skilled labor either in Israel or Gaza. Plus, tens of thousands of Jewish Israelis had flocked to the West Bank and Gaza, eager to establish, and in some cases re-establish, communities that had existed for centuries. But Gaza is tiny, with an extremely high birth rate. By the 80s, the place was already uncomfortably crowded, especially once Israelis began to build communities along the coast of the Strip. Resentment simmered. Tensions rose, and in 1987, it all fell apart. By this point, violence between Palestinians and Jews was a semi-normal occurrence in the Gaza Strip. But when an Israeli truck crashed into a car full of Palestinian laborers, the Strip exploded into full-scale rebellion. 2 days before the accident, a Jewish man had been stabbed to death. Rumors circulated that the crash was revenge, orchestrated by a family member. It wasn't, but that didn't matter. For 2 decades, Palestinians had lived under Israeli military rule. This was their answer to 20 years of frustration. For 5 years, Gaza and the West Bank burned. Israel had once been seen as the David facing off against the Goliath of the entire Arab world. Now, the news told a different story, broadcasting footage of teenage soldiers in tanks, pointing machine guns at children with rocks. And under the radar, a new Islamist group was forming to fight the Israelis. They called themselves the Islamic Resistance Movement. Acronym, Hamas. Today, everyone knows who Hamas is. But in the chaos of the first Intifada, it wasn't immediately clear that a new enemy had emerged. At least until Hamas started killing Israelis, all while the country battled years of pent-up Palestinian rage and hatred. The Intifada lasted for 5 exhausting years. By 1993, many Israelis were simply done. Few people wanted to send their teenagers to patrol the West Bank and Gaza. The territories surely weren't worth all this bloodshed. But what if the Palestinians governed themselves? Was it time? Were they finally willing to compromise with the Israelis? At the start of this video, I mentioned that the Israelis didn't recognize the PLO. But by 1993, that had changed. The PLO had publicly renounced terrorism and recognized Israel's right to exist. And so, for the first time, sworn enemies sat in the same room, inking agreements that would hopefully result in a Palestinian state one day. In the meantime, Palestinians finally had an autonomous, functioning government of their own, called the Palestinian Authority and led by Yasser Arafat. There was just one fly in the ointment. Actually, there were 3 flies. One was the fact that a significant minority of Israelis was very unhappy with this deal. One was the PLO's near legendary incompetence and corruption. And one was Hamas. Hamas believed that Muslim land was sacred, which meant that no human had a right to give it away to non-Muslims. And so they did everything they could to tank the peace agreements, violently. They weren't alone. There was a small but vocal contingent of Israelis who believed exactly the same thing. Israel was Jewish land. To hand it over was a sin, especially when the price for it was Jewish blood. But even as some Jews marched in the streets calling for the end of the government, Hamas and their cronies kept up their string of suicide bombings, stabbings, and abductions. In total, nearly 300 Israelis were killed. Meanwhile, more and more Israelis took to the streets in droves to protest the peace process, wondering why the government was making deals with people who blew up buses. Despite this tense atmosphere, everyone was shocked when a religious Jewish extremist assassinated the Israeli prime minister. A Jew? Killing another Jew? Not just another Jew, but the leader of the Jewish state? And still, somehow, the peace talks limped on. But everything came crashing down yet again in the year 2000. The Israeli prime minister had just offered Arafat the most generous peace deal in nearly a decade of talks. Arafat walked away. A few weeks later, another Intifada erupted. This wasn't the spontaneous grassroots uprising of 1987. This was centralized and planned, which made it far more deadly. More than 1,000 Israelis and 5,000 Palestinians died in the near daily attacks. And Israelis, heartsick and horrified, did everything they could to stop the attacks that originated in Gaza. They instituted checkpoints and curfews around the Strip. They patrolled the coast in case fishing boats were smuggling in weapons, and they began to build a barrier separating them from their next-door neighbors. The days of going to Gaza for cheap produce were over. There would be no more trips to visit relatives or holy sites. There would be no more work. Gazans who wanted to cross into Israel for any reason were out of luck, unless they were Jewish. Roughly 8,000 Jews still lived in the southern Gaza Strip, in a block known as Gush Katif. You never know, looking at their synagogues and swimming pools, that they lived in one of the most volatile regions in the world. And you never guess that their presence deeply divided the nation. Were they fanatics, making the army guard them day and night from the surrounding 1.3 million Palestinians? Or were they the vanguard, the first line of defense in the inevitable clash between the two peoples? The prime minister may have had his own personal opinions on the matter, but his political strategy was clear. This Jewish enclave inside Gaza was a security nightmare, not to mention extremely expensive to maintain. After the second Intifada, few people had the appetite for more violence. He decided that it was time for Israel to leave the Strip, permanently. He didn't ask for concessions from Palestinian leadership, and though many Israelis were deeply opposed to the plan, he forged ahead.
אנחנו מתחילים את הצעד הקשה והכואב מכל פינוי יישובינו מחבל עזה וצפון השומרון.
Once again, the nation roiled with protests. People worried about civil war. But the so-called disengagement went ahead anyway. By September of 2005, Gaza was Jew-free. True, some had left kicking and screaming, but they left. Any trace of Gaza's Jewish communities was purged. One structure was left intact, and that was the wall that separated Israel from the Gaza Strip. Travel between Gaza and, well, anywhere, soon became a distant dream, because in 2006, the Palestinians held their first elections in over a decade. The PA knew they were not in a good position. They knew that many of the Palestinians supported Hamas. They were not surprised when Hamas won 44% of seats in the Palestinian Legislative Council. Israel, the UN, and the US, however, were shocked. They shouldn't have been. Palestinians were tired of the PA's legendary corruption and inefficiency. They were tired of living in poverty while PA officials pocketed hundreds of millions, if not billions, of dollars. Hamas, on the other hand, provided social services and healthcare. Plus, devout Palestinians appreciated Hamas's commitment to their religion. And of course, some approved of Hamas's rhetoric around freeing Palestine. If the path to liberation was paved in blood, well, that was the price of freedom. The US, Russia, the EU, and the UN demanded Hamas change their stance on Israel. Just recognize your neighbor's right to exist. Stop blowing up their buses and sending rockets across the border, and be chill. Hamas refused, so the Western world stopped sending aid. Not that this mattered. Hamas was getting more and more funding from Iran, which was looking to expand its role in the region. The only people who were affected were ordinary folks and PA employees, the very people that the Western world was trying to promote. Israel tightened the borders and made a wave of arrests. Still, Hamas clung to power. At first, the Palestinian Authority tried to work with Hamas, but behind the scenes, the US was exerting pressure to disband the government and hold new elections. When that didn't work, they armed the PA's leading party, hoping they'd be able to wrench back power from Hamas. It did not go well. Both the PA and Hamas employed the nastiest methods they could against each other. But Hamas was the last man standing at the end of this summer of violence. They now controlled the entire Gaza Strip, and their first order of business was attacking Israel. An endless barrage through the end of 2007, more than 3,000 mortars and rockets in 2008. Israel entered the territory in 2009 in a futile bid to end the terror. They got hundreds of rockets in response. Israel and Egypt had placed Gaza under a blockade when Hamas took over in 2007. Anything that went into Gaza was strictly controlled and fully inspected. But the attacks just kept coming. Where were all these weapons coming from? Today, that's a rhetorical question. Everyone knows that for the past 17 years, Hamas has poured billions into its elaborate system of underground tunnels. Tunnels were nothing new in the region. Israel had discovered the first one in 1983. Back then, they were used for smuggling purposes. They still are. But when Hamas took over, they upped their game, building thousands of tunnels crisscrossing from Gaza to Egypt and Israel. A vast system buried multiple stories under the ground. Oh, and in case you thought that the tunnels were in some way defensive, think again. They're not there to help Gazans, they're there to help Hamas.
البعض يتساءل وهذا سؤال رائج وشائع يعني من قام بتشييد 500 كيلومتر من الأنفاق لماذا لم يشيد مآوي يلجأ إليها المدنيون خلال القصف؟
نحن شيدنا الأنفاق لأنه لا نملك ما ندفع به عن أنفسنا من القتل والاستهداف.
This horrible status quo persisted for over a decade. And then, almost abruptly, Hamas seemed to relax. They released a new charter that seemed to accept Israel's right to exist. They didn't get involved when another terrorist group sent a barrage of rockets to Israel in 2022. Israel relaxed its blockade and upped the number of Gazan work permits. If they could relieve some of the Strip's choking poverty, perhaps Hamas would soften its stance. There were still rocket attacks. Hamas was, at its core, still a terrorist group. But for Israelis, at least life was relatively peaceful. Until October 7th, 2023. By now, you've seen the footage and heard the numbers. Israelis woke up on October 7th to learn that Hamas's quiet had been a ruse. They'd been playing the long game. And despite Israel's punishing assault on the Strip, they vowed to do it again and again and again.
نصير لازم نقدمها وحنقدمها مرة ثانية وثالثة.
قادرين نعمل 7 أكتوبر مرات عديدة لأنه خلص إذا دخلت عليها ننهاروا.
Israel entered the Strip 21 days after the invasion. Their aim is to end Hamas once and for all. They've destroyed tunnel after tunnel, killed thousands of combatants, and rescued 7 living hostages. But Israel keeps finding new tunnels, almost as fast as it destroys the old ones. Among the thousands and thousands killed are civilians too, many of them children who did nothing wrong. And though half of the hostages were brought home after negotiations, more than 100 remain in Gaza. It's confirmed that at least 1/3, maybe more, are no longer alive. The IDF spokesperson has said that the war could last through the end of 2024. Meanwhile, people are dying. Most Gazans are displaced. More than 70% of the Strip's buildings are no longer standing. Hundreds of thousands of Israeli civilians have been evacuated from the north and the south, and no one seems to know what will happen next. Some Israelis are agitating for a return to Gaza. They want to rebuild the communities they left behind in 2005. And everyone just wants to see this war end. They want their loved ones back home. They want the hostages released, hopefully alive. And they want to heal after the trauma of 10/7. Palestinians deserve a life free of airstrikes and bombings, free of so-called leaders that keep them mired in decades of war and military rule. Like all humans, they deserve a life of safety and dignity. And both Israelis and Palestinians need to heal before they can ever trust one another again. Who will rule Gaza after the war? That's anyone's guess. But who owns the land? It's deeply meaningful to both peoples. It is at the center of both of our identities. No matter who's in charge of Gaza, we are both children of this ancient land. And our job is to stop watering its soil with our blood.